So let's talk about 5 of the strongest units in Warhammer 40k right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today I thought it might be interesting to look at some of the strongest things in the game across multiple codexes and talk about what makes them such a big threat on the battlefield right now. Of course, in a game like 40k there are literally hundreds and hundreds of units, and I think it's perfectly possible to argue for different units being the strongest thing, but I think that the 5 that I've picked you could make a pretty decent argument for being one of the strongest in the game. If there's any important units that you think I've missed, please let me know down in the comments. In any case, let's jump straight into it and talk about some of 40k's biggest threats. First up, I thought we'd start with none other than the Nemesis Dreadknight itself. The Grey Knight souped-up Terminator Walker instantly became a common sight in tournament lists as soon as the new codex dropped. I think it certainly says something when there's army lists that are going around that are literally just 3 patrol detachments, allowing you to fit in 6 Dreadknights into an army, between 3 Grandmasters and 3 regular ones. The Nemesis Dreadknight is just a strong all-round damage dealer, and a pretty horrific threat as a frontline unit. I do think they're certainly a touch undercosted for what they do, a model that's ludicrously dangerous in every phase of the game. Currently the most common build is to take the Gatling Silencer, Heavy Side Cannon and the Nemesis Greatsword. All of those seem to be the best picks in their relative categories. That gives you an 175 point standard Dreadknight or a 205 point Grandmaster, and you might consider upgrading it a little further with a Dreadknight Teleporter, which can allow you to use a couple of stratagems. First up, the movement's okay at 9 inches, that'll get it into battle and into range of things. If you want to, you can deep strike them for free, so you can keep one enormous threat back to commit it to the right place. And if you buy in the teleporter for 10 points, you could pay 2 command points to jump one across the board turn 1, and it allows some other shenanigans such as falling back and shooting. Damage wise, these dreadnoughts will psychic you, shoot you and melee you, all fairly equally happily. The psychic power you get decent choice as well, you can just smite, you can use hammer hand to reroll all your wound rolls in melee, or you could use a Brotherhood specific psychic power such as the Swordbearers one to make all of their shooting +1 to wound against one target. Being a psyker, it also means that they're Deny the Witch as well, which is just an added bonus. Shooting wise, you get a pretty decent amount of volume fire out of them, 12 shots at strength 5 AP-1 damage 1, and then a further 6 at a big strength 8 AP-2 and damage 2. Those can both get even stronger with a command points to get more AP if you need it, or a Dominus Discipline power to give you +1 damage against your chosen target. That can make their shooting really come into its own. Dreadknights are a core unit as well, so it does allow them rerolls and things from nearby Grandmasters, so you can layer that damage buff on all the rest. Finally, melee wise, that Greatsword is a good take-all-comers choice, either 5 attacks at strength 10 AP-3 and damage d6, or a big 10 attacks at strength 6 AP-2 and damage 2 if you're fighting things like Space Marines or Hordes. Grandmasters of course punch even better, 6 attacks hitting on 2s will be massively more threat. So they've got fast movement and decent damage in every phase, and despite that they're not even all that easy to kill. They're decent on the toughness front as well, 13 wounds at toughness 6, 2 up save, 4 plus invul, and your Grey Knight 5 plus shrug off against mortal wounds, very relevant in 40k at the moment. I think in general it's just going to be quite rare that multiple Dreadknights aren't a scary threat for an army to face, all round murderous damage dealing, and not all that easy to kill in return either. Finally, on top of that, Grandmasters can get even more tricks. They can get Warlord traits such as +1 to charge or melee buffs, the Sigil of Exigence, that relic that allows them to teleport away when they're shot at, and they can be upgraded with the Wisdom of the Prognosticars to give them the Servant of the Throne. That gives them a 3 plus invul save for a turn, so it makes them extraordinarily tanky. In general, I just wouldn't be too surprised if Dreadknights got a small balance change the next time that Games Workshop updates points or something. Next up, my second choice might be a little bit less meta-heavy, but just for the points cost that you pay for a single powerful model, Abaddon the Despoiler is just ludicrously good value. Even though Chaos Marines certainly have a whole load of issues at the moment, Abaddon himself I think is really doing himself justice as the de facto antagonist in 40k right now. For an all-round powerful character, I think you're really going to struggle to beat him anywhere else in the game. Abaddon is 220 points, so relatively good value for a big boss I think, and he just brings some crazy numbers to the game, both in terms of his buffing power for nearby Chaos Marines and also the massive damage that he himself can mete out. The only thing that's holding him back from seeing the table more often is being in the Black Legion, maybe one of the weaker Chaos Space Marine legions power-wise, and if I were him I think I'd be fuming that I didn't have some slightly more adept and powerful minions to command. For his leadership abilities, Abaddon gives you 2 command points if he's the Warlord to start with, That's always a nice advantage, and you could argue that that's worth a fair few points just by itself. Then he gets an aura of reroll hits for any Black Legion units within 6 inches. Due to the core keyword not having reached the Chaos Space Marine Codex yet, this means that he can command all the big guns that way. He can give it to things like Chaos Decimators, Volkite Contemptors, or Chaos Leviathans if he wants to. So a small clutch of powerful shooters trailing it in Abaddon's wake doesn't seem like the worst. Next up, Black Legion units ignore morale within 12 inches. They don't ignore melee, but they do quite like that. Sorry again for the small typo there. Morale's maybe a little bit on the mediocre side in 9th edition, but that is genuinely quite helpful for things like cultist screens, and it's quite nice to know that your chaff infantry aren't just going to melt away to leadership if you roll a bit badly. Finally, and part of the most recent update to Chaos Space Marines, Death to the False Emperor got buffed in 2 different ways. It's changed to just getting extra hits rather than an extra hit roll, and now it works on everyone. As Abaddon's Warlord trait made him proxy Death to the False Emperor on 5+, for him and everyone within 6 inches of him, he's now an absolutely monstrous combat buffing piece, even more so than he helps out shooting units, and that boost will help himself out as well and his own combat damage. Talking of which, after he's snapped off a few shots with a Talon of Horus with its strength 4 and damage D3 in the shooting phase, he'll get to work with Dreadknight. Unless he gets unlucky and has to fall back on the Talon of Horus in combat, he'll get around 7 to 13 attacks with it, which with average rolling including rerolls and his exploding 6s, that'll usually kill around about 12 guardsmen, 8 space marines, whether they're Gravis or normal marines, will do about 12 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. If he needs to really punch up against a heavy hitter and is wounding on 5+, you could think about Veterans of the Long War, easy access to +1 to wound for 1 command point. Finally, for a character, he's really not all that easy to take out either. Toughness 5, 8 wounds, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and halving incoming damage. That's decently tanky for a character, particularly against any damage 2 weapons that you might see. So after he's been stomping up the board buffing some guns, and hopefully countercharged and killed something important, he's going to take some significant resources to gun down as well. Overall, certainly one of the most powerful characters in all of 40k right now. Maybe he'll see a bit more success in tournament type games whenever Chaos get their new codex perhaps. Moving on to talk some Tyranids, and I think that this list wouldn't have been complete without one of the bogeymen of the meta right now in the Hive Guard. These Tyranid elites show why Games Workshop needs to be quite careful about handing out massive buffs to ignore line of sight weaponry, unless you just want to be playing a game of removing your models while the nids hide behind some big building. Hive Guard are a Tyranid elite's choice and a pretty adept bombardment organism, 45 points per model when you take the Impaler Cannon, OK toughness at toughness 5, 3 wounds and a 4+ save, but the toughness doesn't really matter all that much when they're hidden out of line of sight, which in general they will be. Their base stats make them kind of useful, though it's really the buffs that make them go to the next level. Your Impaler Cannons fire 2 shots at strength 8, AP -2 and damage D3, hitting on 3s, and then they have a 36-inch range, ignores line of sight, and ignores cover as well. That's a damage profile that very few things are going to be able to happily tank. A couple of shots for making efficient damage on infantry, high strength for hurting the heaviest tanks, and ignores cover helps shore up a little bit against some very slightly low AP. 36 inches might mean that sometimes they might be outranged, but in general in 9th edition you have to scrap for objectives in the midfield. Most of the time I think it's just not going to be viable to outrange them with every important unit in your army. Then on top of that already decent profile you can stack them with all manner of buffs. High Fleet Leviathan can get them 4 rerolls to hit with Swarm Leader, Kronos can get them rerolling 1s to hit with exploding 6s from their psychic power, Tyranid Warriors can use their Synaptic Link to have them hitting on 2+, and then you've got access to the Shoots Twice stratagem for 2 CP, and an extra command point for Leviathan can then give you exploding 6s to hit. If we say take the 4 rerolls to hit, shooting twice and exploding 6s, with those buffs alone, one sub 300 point unit will happily one-shot 22 guardsmen, 10 space marines, or 23 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, and with that kind of damage you can just happily hoover up 1 enemy threat per turn, while the rest of your army goes about to do its thing. It's just the kind of firepower that only the very toughest armies are going to be able to shrug off, particularly when they have the rest of a Tyranid force to deal with in the meantime. Other than that, they could potentially use the 5+ invul from the Crusher Stampede formation, and with that one incentivizing some big bugs, you could even think about some shooting buffs from things like the Turvagon or the Maliceptor. It's not to say that they're all powerful, -1 damage or anything that can ignore AP -2 will both cause some issues, as will chipping away a few models if you do have a bit of quality ignores line of sight shooting, maybe things like a boosted Manticore with full payload, or a Plague Burst Crawler using Disgusting Force Could well kill a Hive Guard or two with those damage 3 attacks, and that could diminish the squad's efficiency if you're using the command points to fire twice. Tagging them in melee perhaps is the most surefire way to shut them up for a bit, but that's not going to be the easiest to do if you do have quite a lot of Tyrannid bogs to wade through to get there. Overall, I think that Hive Guard are just one of those units when you see them on the other side of the board, that they're almost guaranteed to cause you pretty decent problems, or you're going to need to plan something intelligent to try and deal with them. Next up, with its prevalence in so many lists, both Chaos and Imperium, I think it would be wrong to leave the Volkite Contemptor Dreadnought off this list, a 4/12 choice that has become near ubiquitous recently. These things have been making a ridiculous amount of appearances as a strong generic source of Space Marine firepower that can hurt just about anything. These Contemptor Dreadnoughts use the Relic Contemptor or the Chaos Contemptor Dreadnought datasheets, the ones found in the Imperial Armor Compendium, and with the 2 sets of twin Volkite Culverins, it costs you 150 points plus 1 command point, and that gives you a fairly durable Dreadnought with 16 shots at Strength 6, AP 0 and Damage 2, and on top of that they generate a mortal wound on a wound roll of a 6. It's really quite an interesting damage profile that's almost equally good against everything. It'll certainly chew through low armor save hordes like no tomorrow, but that many shots with multi-damage certainly stacks some decent saves on heavy targets, plus the mortal wounds are absolutely great value on anything that's relying on high saves, good armor or good invuls to keep it safe. In particular though, it will absolutely love shooting against things like Toughness 3 infantry wounded on 2s, Toughness 6 Drukhari raiders, or just about anything that's Toughness 5, things like Sisters of Battle penitent engines, Drukhari grotesques, or Orc boys. You can usually expect 1 or 2 mortal wounds out of this thing each time it shoots, but it can swing very very high if you suddenly roll a clutch of 6s. It's pretty crazy on those times when you get lucky and you just hoover up an enemy unit that really shouldn't have died to that attack. A range of 45 inches is another decent advantage. You're not going to be able to outrange this thing most of the time, and a lot of people opt to add a Cyclone missile launcher on top of the Dreadnought for an extra 25 points, just to give it an extra couple of powerful anti-tank shots, maybe dealing with a few of the targets that the Culverins struggle with a bit. Otherwise, its durability is pretty decent, 9 wounds at Toughness 7 with a 3+ save and a 5+ invul, and the -1 damage for being a Dreadnought. The Space Marine ones get Wisdom of the Ancients for a 1 command point reroll hits or wounds bubble. That can be a nice pop-up damage buff if you want to buff a few Dreadnoughts that way, and its speed is a little bit better than some as well at 8 inches, and has a small amount of accurate melee if the opponent does opportunistically tag them. There's a good chance they could kill a light infantry model or 2, and maybe free itself from combat if it gets lucky. There's an absolute ton of combos available for it, both from the Space Marine chapters and the Chaos Legions. Maybe these are some of the most interesting though. Iron Hands can make it a character for 1 command point, then if you put it next to some bodyguards it can't be shot. That makes it a bit of a nightmarish little gun turret, and they have a stratagem to put it back in the Devastator Doctrine to get AP on those Volkite Culverins, various other vehicle tricks and psychic powers, and it can take a Warlord trait like the one to get exploding 6s with its ranged attacks when shooting. Deathwatch makes some of the best Dreadnought castles in the game. They can stack normal Captain and Tech Marine boosts, with things like 4 rerolls to wound against a given datasheet. That's really great on those Culverins, and Aura ignores cover and bonuses against fly targets with that Auspicator. Finally, I think that Death Guard may be worth special mention on the Chaos side. These Volkite Dreadnoughts will really love standing next to a Tallyman, getting out the +1 to hit and exploding 6s to hit as well from his relic, mean that you're just going to get a whole load more value out of your gun platform while he sits around farming his command points. To be honest, I wouldn't be too surprised if the Volkite Culverins see a small nerf at some point, just for the way that they do seem to be oppressing a lot of other options, though to be honest I think that quite a lot of Space Marine gun platforms could just use a bit of a buff, particularly things like the tanks, storm speeders and flyers perhaps. In any case, until that happens, I think this guy will remain quite an easy include in top lists. Next up, I thought it might well be worth mentioning one of the single strongest Orc datasheets going around, though there's perhaps some fairly stiff competition from things like that Beast Boss on the Squigosaur, or maybe the Megatrax Scrapjets within the same category. While those are still very solid, I chose to talk about the Rukkatrukk Squigboggy today. Again, another example of one of those units that does its main role very well, and then just happens to do a whole bunch of other things really well as well. The Rukkatrukk Squigboggy was one of the clear winners out of the new Orc Codex, getting an absolutely massive buff in its usefulness, dropping to 90 points, and being a basically auto-include Orc artillery unit, to the extent where Games Workshop felt the need to limit the squads of each buggies to just 1 squad of each, as it certainly wasn't too uncommon to see big units of 9 of these in some top tournament lists. Still though, as a single unit of 1 to 3 of these, I think is very near an auto-include status for Orc armies right now. They just bring so much value for how many points you invest. Obviously the main draw is their artillery damage, 2d6 strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2 shots at 36 inches hitting on a 4+, and then if you get a bit closer you can use that secondary squig launcher, hitting on 5s with the same profile at 18-inch range. Very respectable ignores line of sight damage, particularly dangerous against things like Space Marines, but basically shooting them at things that are trying to score key objectives or fragile damage dealers that thought they were hidden and safe is usually going to be a pretty safe bet. Unlike the Hive Guard though, these things are incredibly mobile, a decent movement at 10 inches, and they're also not completely worthless in combat either. They get 4 attacks at strength 7, AP -2 and damage 2 in melee, all hitting on 4s, so you're pretty likely to rough up at least a few enemy infantry if they do try and charge you to lock you down. Range damage wise, they can also get a boost from the Speed War upgrade. Having -1 extra AP on those AP2 guns is nice against heavies, so they can make a lot more sense in that kind of list with a Deathkiller Wartrike. Otherwise they're at least reasonably tough with 9 wounds and ramshackle, so -1 damage on anything that's strength 7 or less, pretty nice against autocannons that would normally wreck these quite easily. In addition, the Speed Bomb vehicles have a -1 to hit stratagem that can make the units a bit harder to deal with at range, and you might be able to use a custom force field if one's nearby as well, a 6+ invul that can make them a little bit tougher, going to a 5+ if you decide to overcharge it. Armies wise, they also gain some decent benefits from a few of the different clans. Evil Sons can be extra mobile, advancing and shooting all the time. Freebooters can be a good unit to trigger their +1 to hit bonus. Their main gun won't get any benefit themselves as that's already +1 to hit, but they're a pretty perfect unit to finish off one weakened enemy unit and have the rest of the army open up a broadside after that. Finally, they're the pretty much ideal unit if you do want to use their Army of Renown, the Speed Mob. They get faster, being able to advance every turn for no penalty, a 5+ invul save when they do, better melee with an extra attack, reroll ones from a nearby warlord trait, and a stratagem to allow them to fall back and shoot as well, which they'll really like with all of those blast weapons. If you're taking a speed mob, there's absolutely no reason not to take a big unit of 3 of these. Finally, I thought we'd just include one more bonus entry, as it's kind of impossible to make a strongest things in 40k video without talking about Drukhari right now. Though the main problem with Drukhari is that they don't just have one strong datasheet, they have quite a lot that all seem fairly equally nasty, and perhaps become even more scary when they're used in combo. Since the latest balance pass changes, the Drukhari Homunculus Covens are just all round scary, with every single unit being well worth of consideration, and are perhaps one of the lists to beat in 40k right now. Typically they'll be making very good use of the -1 damage custom Coven. That's helpful on anything with multi-wounds, and even on the racks if they happen to be shot by 2 wound damage, as it makes their feel no pains a bit easier. Being Drukhari, they have all sorts of easy buffs built in as well. Advance and charge from turn 2 certainly helps some relatively slower units get to melee faster, as well as tricks like their never stationary stratagem to catapult certain units up the board. Their invuls get better towards the later stages of the game, and they also have some good access to Fight's last abilities. There's a lot of things going for the pointy elves at the moment. First up we have the Grotesques at 35 points, 4 wounds with toughness 5, a 6-up invul, a 5+ feel no pain and -1 damage, and between all of those crazy stacking saves and buffs it means that a lot of damage is just going to melt away. Then when they reach you in combat, it's 5 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2, all hitting on 3s, and a couple of pretty handy stratagems that you can crack out if you need a bit more hurt. The Talos bring some similarly generalist melee, all of those same defensive buffs on a 7 wound profile at toughness 6 with a 3+ armor save this time, a couple of legitimately scary anti-tank shots with heat lances, and then some more general purpose melee with a good chance for some mortal wounds from their Talos Ichor injector. Kronos, even after their points bump, are just really cheap and really durable, to the extent where a lot of people seem to pass up the -1 damage Coven for them, instead of going for Dark Technomancers, which gives them a pretty brutal flamer attack at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2 with a +1 to wound. They're going to be super annoying to scrape off objectives for the toughness that they bring for the cost. They pack a little bit of melee with the ability to restore models, and also reroll 1s to wound as well. Finally, supporting the advance of the lumbering pain engines, we have the cheap and efficient 7-point racks, bringing some tough objectives secured and some nice anti-infantry melee, and the Homunculi themselves at just 70 points now, giving out +1 toughness to all of their creations, and can heal every single one of the above units. Things like Grotesques are going to be a lot harder to deal with when they're toughness 6 and they grow their wounds back. Overall, I was struggling to pick out any one of these units that I think really stands out massively above the others. All of them are very solid, and ridiculously good value compared with a lot of other units that other armies can field. So let me know what you think. Are there other units that you think belong in the top 5 or my bonus inclusion? There's plenty of other very scary stuff out there in 40k at the moment. Maybe if I get enough suggestions there might well be a part 2 to this video. If you've enjoyed watching, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying watching the videos quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.